he's like, I'm going to seal the record, pending that you stay sober and you're going to have a second chance on life. It's not going to follow you. You're not going to have a felony. Like, you're going to be able to literally go back into society as if none of this happened, as long as you stay sober, and I never see you in my courtroom ever again. And if I do, you will not get out of prison until you're 30 years old.
Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to get into this. You got a pretty wild story. You really wide range of story topics we could go into here. So it's exciting to kind of get into it. Why don't you? What I'd like to do is kind of start off more of it in a chronological order. How you grew up, and then walking through everything and how you got into all that, and then we'll go ahead and talk about where you're at now and kind of go from there.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm Steve Wolf. I'm 38 years old. I hail originally from Los Angeles, now in San Diego. I was born in West Hollywood. In the good old year of 1984. And I had just about as like normal of a childhood as I think that anyone could really hope for, which is an interesting part of my story, because it's like I didn't. That is not where the trouble began. The trouble began like much later on in life, but for all intents and purposes, my life was normal. We were living in like West Hollywood. My father was a podiatrist. He had done his residency at Cedars-Sinai, which is where I was born. So that's kind of where we ended up. My mom and him met in Laguna Beach and got married. Dad's originally from Chicago area. Mom's originally from New York area, and they were both working in Southern California. And so that's where my brother and I were born. And then we lived there for a couple of years. And then I think, my folks, we were, I think the first house I grew up on was like on Robertson and Santa Monica Boulevard. So that's, that's an interesting part of Los Angeles, but like we lived right next to like a drag queen. And, it was like really just sort of loud and a lot going on over there in,
What do you mean you lived next to a drag queen?
Well, I think when my folks bought the place, that was before my brother and I were born. And, West Hollywood is like one of the more, I don't know, kind of like that's like the gay district part of LA, and, which is fine. But I think that it's like one of those things, like before you have kids, what seems like a good place for you and your wife to live, that might be like kind of fun and hip. You start questioning everything, like when some kids come along the way. I've had that experience before with my own kids. So, I mean, I think, my parents, when they made the decision to move down to San Diego from there, it wasn't because they were homophobic or trying to like run away. I think they just wanted their kids to have sort of like a slower pace of life, is a good way of putting it, It's
pretty loud and moving, fast paced out there in Hollywood.
Yeah. If you know the area, I mean, there's like a lot going on, you know what I mean? It's not necessarily dangerous or anything like that, but there's a lot going on, And so, like I said, we were living next door to like a drag queen, I guess. And I don't think my parents were getting along with the other neighbor. And I think most of the complaints, the story my mom told me is that the neighbor was, I don't know, like a grumpy old like person neighbor, and they called Child Protective Services.
Like the drag queen was?
No, other neighbor. The drag queen was probably fine, right? The drag queen was probably fine. It was the other neighbor was like an old, I think like widowed man, and he would like call Child Protective Services just because like we were crying too loud, not because anything was going on. We were just like crying and it was pissing him off. And so he was just like call CPS, and they'd show up at the house and like want to do an inspection. And my parents were just like done and wanted like a slower pace of life. So they moved to inland San Diego when I was probably about like 9 or 10. And and that's where I sort of spent, I don't know, more of my formative years, at least like in elementary school, middle school, and into high school, And it was like there, like I said, we had a very normal childhood. Mom and dad were there. My dad was a podiatrist. So, I mean, let's call it upper middle class. We definitely weren't struggling for money, and we weren't like super rich or anything either. So we were kind of like on the upper end of that, but we, lived in a neighborhood where a lot of the neighbors were, I don't know, doctors, attorneys, things like my dad, you know what I mean? Upper middle class sort of working people. And most of the moms didn't really work. They kind of stayed, at home with like the kids. And that was kind of the world that I grew up in. And I think that, did all the normal stuff that you do as like a 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old kid. I was in like baseball and played sports, and so did my brother. And, back then before cell phones, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram was like a thing. We used to ride our bikes and play with sticks and, do all this stuff and that you do when you're a kid. And I think it's like a lost art, but it's interesting being a part of like my generation. Technically, I think I'm a millennial. But strangely enough, it's like the millennials on a spectrum, because I'm the part of like the older millennial that grew up in a world where there was no internet, was no social media. Cell phones weren't even a thing until like, till high school is like almost done. Right. And into college. So I got to experience two parts of the world where like none of that existed. And then, growing up sort of in my formative years, like through all of it, which is an interesting perspective to have on the world, I think, especially today. And
so would you say that you kind of started to rebel after a while?
Yeah, I think what happened was at around like 10 years old, there was like this anger that was like inside of me, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Like I think the best way to describe it was like I just felt different, and without having, like I said, because my family was I came from a very normal family, so without having like my finger to put anything on it, I just felt different. I stopped feeling like I fit in, and it was scary. And I think like dealing with the fear, because it's hard to articulate at that age. You don't know how you feel because you don't really.
Did you have a lot of friends then?
Yeah. I mean, I had like a normal amount of friends, like I had a couple of friends that like I hung out with, like a little squad. And, we were all just like very normal kids from like very normal, middle upper class, like working families. And so that was just it. Like I couldn't put my finger on it. I just like had this anger inside, and I would act out with other kids, like getting into fights. I would take a lot of it, most of it out like on my parents, and specifically my mom, because she was, there to deal with like the brunt of it. And that was like just tantrums and acting out, lying, just being like a bad, I don't know, normal kid. You know what I mean?
Bad normal kid.
A bad normal kid, meaning that it's like I hadn't gotten into anything like too crazy, but it was just like I was getting hard to deal with. You know what I mean? I was getting, that anger was beginning to turn into like violence. And, I think my parents not knowing what to do, how
was it turning into violence?
Well, I would just like, I get angry. Like somebody would say something that would make me upset, and like I would see red, you know what I mean? And that's when it started turning violent. Like even at that young age, I even had an outlet for it. So again, it's like one of those things where just like, you can't put your finger on it, but it all stemmed from the feeling of like inadequacy, or not feeling like I fit in, not feeling like I fit in with anything anymore. Like the sports didn't work. Everything kind of felt like, I was like, I wasn't being authentic or like my real self. Like there was a part of it, a part of me that was just like trying to break out, was trapped in sort of this like world that I just like felt inauthentic to me. And I think a lot of it, looking back, was what I'll get into next, just like alcoholism, addiction, which runs in like the family, but had skipped a generation with, my mom and dad. And then the other half, it was just like normal adolescent stuff that like you deal with, that I think that you deal with, coming into like puberty and all the changes that you're making. And, you think about how much your life changes, just going from like, elementary school into middle school, and then middle school like into high school, and like the friends like that you had, you know, in middle school changed in like high school, and you know, things just got like different. And by the time I was like getting like by the time I was like halfway through middle school, I think I reached that place where, you know, my parents didn't know what to do, so they got me some like professional help, right? I started seeing therapists, and I don't know how much the therapists were like really helping, because it's like I said, I didn't really have anything to complain about. You know,
Right.
it's not like I was getting abused at home. It wasn't like I came from a low income, dangerous like part of town or something where I was like at risk and I saw a lot of bad things happening or something like that. I was just like a suburban white kid, you know, from like a normal family that had all the things that he's supposed to have in order to move forward in life, and just hated it. You know, just felt completely out of place in that situation. And so the therapists, and you know, in all of their knowledge and everything, determined that I had attention deficit hyper disorder, right? Which was kind of a new diagnosis back in like the early 90s. And they had some magic pills that were going to fix me and mellow me out. And so they prescribed me like a bunch of different.
Hey, let's pause for a second.
Sure. We got the old vacuum.
Hey, Shane. Have we filled that vacuum?
What the fuck is that?
Vacuum. I'm like, what the hell is going on here? All right, where were we?
Talking about therapists.
Yeah. Okay. So the therapist, they diagnosed you with ADHD.
Yeah, and then ultimately, you know, that diagnosis like was extrapolated to like clinical depression, and you know, they started trying all the different types of like new wonder drugs.
How did they make the leap from ADHD to depression?
Well, because I would have these episodes of, you know, just like depression that they would, you know, I think they at first diagnosed it as like bipolar disorder and then into depression. And I don't really understand the difference between the two. I think that ADHD, bipolar disorder, clinical depression, especially if there isn't like one event or some trauma that's happened, could be tacked up to, you know, if you like put a name on it, just sort of like middle class suburban white kid syndrome, you know?
Yeah.
And I think, interestingly enough, I think a lot of white kids that sort of come from that same or similar situation are all experiencing the same thing today. You know, like we live in like a very woke society. And it's kind of a, you know, it's like, if you understand like the dynamics of everything that you've seen like in the news or media over the years, there's just like a lot of, you know, it's like hard to be I don't want to say it's hard, but let's call it different. It's very different to be like a middle-aged white kid from a normal family these days. You know what I mean? You, just by being that, you're already at a disadvantage, you know?
Which is the opposite of what everybody tells you.
Right. You're already a target. You know what I mean? You're a white male, so you're supposed to be at the top of the patriarchal triangle, with all of the white privilege that's allotted to you right now. But, you know, from what I'm seeing, strangely enough, it tends to be like those kids that are shooting up elementary schools these days, you know what I mean? That feel like they've lost their place or do not have a place in society. And I think that, you know, at that age, coming back to like my own story, I think that there's like a lot of that going on. You know, you're an impressionable young, almost like pre-teenager that doesn't feel like they fit in, that don't really want the life that your parents are trying to give to you, that don't feel like you have an outlet for that creative expression, that, you know, there's a lot, you feel like you're hitting a lot of dead ends, right? And then at the same time, you have everybody with degrees that are adults, other races, minorities, religions, telling you that you have it better than everybody else does at the same time. Therefore, don't ask for help. You know, you already have all the help and the privilege that you need. So you're good. And if you can't figure it out with like what you have, then like you're spoiled anyway. And you should just die, disappear, kill yourself, you know what I mean? Shoot up a school. And I think that, I don't know, I'm not a doctor or anything, so I'm extrapolating these opinions. Disclaimer, like these are my opinions alone. And I'm not a doctor. I haven't done any research when it comes to this, but I ponder these things. I think about these things when it comes to my own story, because that was me, and the outlet that I ultimately found was drugs and alcohol via the punk rock scene and music, at a very young age. I think
How did you start getting into that?
At 11 years old, it all started with the Pennywise album. A friend of mine, let's call him Scarface, that was his nickname, brought this like album, and he's like, God, you should check out this check out this CD. Like, I've never heard anything like this before. And I think it was like the Pennywise Unknown Road album. And I listened to it, and it was like loud and fast and so raw and like visceral. And, from my just like very white suburban like lifestyle, it seemed just like something so different from like what I was like used to hearing. It felt like real, it felt like something I could identify with, like that voice inside that was screaming, wanting to get out. And like, I fell in love with that music, and like very quickly, started listening to a lot of other bands, and like picked up my first guitar and started like teaching myself how to play, and, finding all the other kids that were like into that music, which, strangely enough, were from like the other side of town and not from the neighborhood that like I grew up in. And I started sort of levitating more towards kids that came from like, I don't know, a less fortunate side of town. I wouldn't call it like a poor side of town or anything. It wasn't poverty or anything like that. But, most of my friends at that time changed. And all of a sudden, like the friends and the people that I hung out with were, friends that came from broken families. Dad took off, there was like a divorce a long time. There was like abuse in the home. And, I didn't move towards that on purpose. It just felt like those people were real, that they were struggling with like real problems. And so the music that I was listening to, and now like the people that I was hanging around with kind of matched and, felt real to me. Like at the time, felt more real than like the friends that I'd hang out with like around like the neighborhood that I grew up in, which just like, I don't know. I mean, you know a little bit about where you come from. It's like, you can understand that. It's like rich kids are the worst, you know, like they're more afraid of their parents than like the police,
right?
Which means that you can't trust them. You just can't trust those kids. And so like, it was like I had a squad, and I kind of have my music now, and I had an identity. And that's kind of where, I got like high for the first time. I drank for the first time. It's all punk rock shows. You know what I mean? Like at 12, 13 years old, and having that feeling of like having like a crew and like fitting in and doing what they did. And then sort of like a soundtrack to like your life at the same time. That all like was working for me. And all the, my introduction to drugs at that point had been narcotics that were prescribed by psychiatrists. So to make the jump in my head to go from like, the drugs that they were giving me to like drugs that I was like taking that like a punk rock show, I didn't really see the difference, right? The drugs that I was getting worked better, Right. And it made me feel like alive, like I fit in, like my real true self.
Do you remember the first time that you got high?
Yeah. I mean, it was I was at another buddy's house, and I think he's like had his sister's bong or something, and had no idea like what we were doing. And at first I didn't think it was working, and then and then it was working, and there was that feeling of.
Was it weed or?
Yeah, it was weed. It was weed, and then alcohol. Like I drank for the first time at like a couple shows here and there, but never really got like drunk. You know what I mean? Call it like teenagers, just sort of like trying to be cool and like fit in and be like, drinking like warm Natty's Ice or like whatever you could kind of steal out of like the garage from like your parents. And it wasn't really working, but like, smoking pot for the first time. Like I got high, and like shortly thereafter, I remember I got like real drunk for the first time, but it was that same feeling of just like, like you took a deep breath and everything's going to be okay. You know what I mean? Like a fuzzy, warm feeling that the world is like, your blanket, and, surrounded by people that like you feel understand you and like got your back with something that you're into, and like more of a direction that I've ever had. And like now being able to ease like the uncomfortable feelings of just like how to fit in and sort of like socially lubricate like the wheels so that like I could not just be so wound up, you know what I mean? And so tight. And that worked really well for me for a couple of years,
And so did you get into anything heavier, or was that?
Yeah. Ultimately it was kind of a mix of, I started playing in like my first band when I was 12, right? With a couple friends. And, we were like, we were pretty horrible.
So you guys started a band in like your garage, or what?
Yeah, exactly. With some kids across town. In fact, what happened was I had gotten kicked out of high school for the first time, rewind the story after like the initial like drug use, before I got into harder things, my parents kind of took notice that I was like, I don't know, I was acting differently, and again, them not knowing, exactly what to do, because like they hadn't experienced that like with them, with like themselves, you know what I mean? And they were trying to like help out when I was confronted, for the first time over like drug use, at about like, I think it was just shy going into like my freshman year, so it would have been like sort of going into my freshman year. So like, what does that make me? 12 or 13, I think 13 years.
Yeah. 13.
Yeah. And, so they caught me with some like weed and some pot and stuff, and nothing really hard or crazy like at that point. But I was getting the talk of just like, what are you doing with your life? And who are these kids you're hanging out with? And, my dad was like my number one fan. So he couldn't think that it was like me that was making all these bad decisions, that I was being influenced by like other people. And the truth is like, I was like the ringleader of like the squad. I was always had all the bad ideas, I was always the one that, that tried to push it too far. And so they, not knowing what to do, and really trying to care and like look out for their son, they got me sent to like a program. It was like, I think they call it like an outdoor wilderness therapy program.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And so 13 years old, I went to my first.
What is that?
It's hard to call it rehab. It's more like bad kid camp, like they're like, how like if you, what was it called? Like back in the day, like there was like, it was like action adventure camp where they like send you out and you do like wilderness training and like whitewater rafting and stuff like that. Well, that wasn't this, right?
Oh, okay.
But I think that was like sort of, that's where the good kids went, right? They went to that, or like, YMCA camp, something fun. What this was like bad kid camp, and they just sent like
bunch of thugs out in the wilderness.
You know what I mean? A bunch of like super young teenage like thugs out in the wilderness. And it was more like a scared straight type of thing, where it's just like, if we make a horrible enough experience from at like a young age, it'll leave such an impression that instead of continuing to go like left, they'll go right.
So did they have like ex-cons and shit with you, or?
No, it was, it's funny looking back on it now. So what happened was like it was like late at night one night, and I was awoken to this like very large man in my room, and he's like, you need to wake up and pack a bag. We're gonna go. And I think we're getting robbed, right?
Oh, shit.
I'm like really
scared. So your parents set this up?
Yeah, they set this up
and didn't tell you about it. No. And then at like sometime in the morning.
Yeah, like, it was like late. It was like, like 12:30, 1 o'clock, like in the morning. I was like,
dude just shows
woken
up
by a big dude, and I was just like, we're getting robbed, and I'm screaming. My mom's like crying. She's like, no, we've hired this guy. Like, you're gonna go with him. He's gonna take you, and we love you so much. And
what are you thinking at that point?
I was like, I was just like, I was really just angry. You know what I mean? I was like angry and felt like betrayed because I didn't understand what was going on. And, they said that I knew that they were like, my folks said that they were upset, and they obviously weren't happy about like the drugs or anything, but they were like, I felt like this was taking it a little too far.
That was the line.
Yeah. And, and I'm just like, I can't, fuck, I can't believe you're doing this to me. And, the guy very calmly was just like, look, we can do this the we can do this the hard way or the easy way. The easy way involves like, we can hit Burger King and you can smoke cigarettes like on the way to where you're going. The hard way is like you're coming with us one way or another.
We're gonna put a bag over your head.
And so knowing, at 13 years old, it's like I didn't really have too many angles like at that point. So I went somewhat willingly with these guys, knowing that like, I couldn't escape it, right? I couldn't really run, and the guy was much bigger than I was. And so, yeah, they put me on a plane. We landed in Las Vegas. We drove a couple hours like north to St. George, Utah, and they dropped me off at a center where they issued me like a tarp and some boots and, a bag of like freeze-dried, refried beans and a bag of rice and just like some real rudimentary like survival skills, and took away all my clothes, strip searched me, and then
they strip searched you.
Yeah. And then blindfolded me and drove me, I don't know, 20 minutes out into the wilderness. And
hold on a second. So you're a 13-year-old kid, you get woken up at midnight.
Yeah.
And you're in San Diego.
Yeah.
Right. So you're not like, that's a 6-7 hour drive.
Yeah, well, no, there was a flight. It was a flight to Las Vegas.
Oh, okay, I missed that.
Right, and then but then it's still another couple hours in St. George.
So you get woken up at midnight, let's say.
Correct.
And then next thing you know, you're with a stranger on an airplane flying to Utah.
Yeah.
And then you're blindfolded and brought to God knows where.
Yeah, they drive me out in the middle of like what I believe is just like BLM land adjacent to St. George.
What were you thinking?
I didn't know what to think. I was like, obviously didn't want to be there, but I had no idea like what to expect because nobody was telling me anything. And you're like 13. You know what I mean?
You're
it's just like,
out.
I was kind of like scared. I wasn't scared like I was getting kidnapped because I was more pissed off at my parents. Like, how could they, like, do they actually know what's happening? You know what I mean? Like, did they, they set this all up for me to go through. And yeah, they after like a 20-30 minute drive, like in the car, they unblindfolded me and they dropped me off with a group of kids that looks like what could be best described as like, what is it? The Lord of the Flies? If you ever read the book.
Okay.
And there's there's like 2 adult counselors and a bunch of 13.
Why did they blindfold you? They didn't want you to go back?
Right. Because they don't want you to run. The same reason they take your boots away at night,
Oh, really?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it was like, it was like you couldn't leave. Right. So remember, you're a minor. Your parents have sort of signed over, temporary guardianship, and these people are in charge of you. Therefore they can make you do. You're not 18 years old. You don't have your own free will. You don't have to be like, along with parental consent, these people have the authority to dictate what you can and can't do when you're a minor,
Right.
And, so I was out there. I was out there in the wilderness.
That's insane, dude.
And yeah, to put it in perspective, the group, these kids start walking up to me and they just look dirty and they kind of smell, and they're asking.
So all these kids were there before you.
Yeah.
And so it's a cyclic thing, right? So people come and go.
Right. What I found out later on in the program, because they don't really tell you anything until you start,
Behaving.
getting some time there, right, and behaving, is that the support, I don't know, let's call them the support team. They come every Friday and they drop off like, food rations, supplies, stuff like that. The counselors change out and they drop off new kids that are in the group, and they also take away like the kids that are sort of graduating the group or like leaving the program at the same time. So once every Friday, they come and they drop new people off and extract the people that are leaving and leave some supplies and leave 2 new counselors that sort of hike around for the week. And that's what you did. You hike around BLM land for a non-specified amount of time, and you do these little workbooks that they give you. The workbooks include like behavior modification, exercises and survival skills. You know what I mean? Like how to build pitfall traps and how to make, a bow drill fire set. And, eventually if like you, in order to like earn things like spices, like salt and pepper, or like a bag of sugar or things like this that you have, because you basically are issued a box of raisins, the freeze-dried, refried beans, and like rice, and like a cup, and you carried a 2-gallon canister with like water drops in them, and you just sort of like hike every day. You hike and you make shelters out of your tarp, which you also fashion into a backpack, and they take your books away at night, and you do these little group things, and a therapist comes out once a week. It was just bizarre. You know what I mean?
That's the craziest thing I've heard.
It was bizarre. It was bizarre. And like, even to this day, that's why like it definitely had an impact on me. I'm like, I won't go camping.
That's the takeaway from it, is you don't go camping.
I won't go camping. And I have these, like, I learned these survival skills. Like, you could send me in the forest with like a buck knife and pack cord, and I'd be fine. I could make shelters. I could, like, I know what plants I could eat. I could kill animals and stuff. But to do it like for fun, just no, I'm good. You know, I'm just like that killed.
So what was the net result of that?
So they, you know, I figured out that was like the first time in my life where like I was in a situation where I knew like the heat was on. I'd really like maybe overshot the mark with my parents. And I figured out that, you know, I just, the heat was on, and like I just needed to get through this program. And I saw kids that were like there pushing 6, 7, 8 months. This is 8 months.
Oh, wow.
This is like, yeah.
It's not a short period of time.
8 months, a year, like out in the wilderness, you know, shitting in a hole, calling a number every 3 to 5 seconds, like just hiking every day and to no end, doing these silly phases. Yeah. So like they'd call, when you went to go poop in a hole, right? You would call your number every 3 to 5 seconds so that they could keep tabs on you from where you were.
So
and they
would know you're not running away.
Exactly. And they take your boots away at night, and they take your boots at night. You couldn't look at maps, you know, stuff like that, until you finally got high enough in the phases to where they knew that you were going to like graduate. Then they'd like show you a map, and they'd give you a knife to like carve wood and stuff like that. And the results is like, I figured out, you know, then and there that you just need to do what these people tell you to do until the heat's off. Tell them what they want to hear, lie to them, whatever, pass the phases, just get through it. Because if you fight this, you're just going to be here for 9, 12 months. And like, they did this in the wintertime too. So I was kind of out there.
Oh no.
I was kind of out there, like, you know, I believe I sort of like ended up out there like August, September, you know, and it was like October, November, December. And I was like getting into the winter, and it was like getting really cold. Yeah. And so at about 5 months in, I spent about 5 months out there. And then I finally graduated the program. And I remember that like they're, you know, they didn't talk. It's so interesting, right? They didn't talk. One point, very little did they ever mention about like drugs and alcohol. And it was all about, you know, behavior modification. And I believe, like, from the looking back on it, I really believe that it was sort of like a Christian organization, because most of the counselors were Mormon, right? Or maybe even LDS type of like organization.
A lot of that out there in Utah is probably like that.
Right. And so I think their angle was like to sort of like address the problems of like, you know, acting out or drugs and alcoholism, sort of just like as a cure-all, like spirituality and faith is kind of a cure-all to all those things, right?
Did they have like church times for you?
No, they didn't really push that hard, but that was kind of what the therapy and the undertones of all of it kind of felt like. But there was no introduction to like, you know, AA or like a 12-step program or anything like that. It not even covered. It was more or less like dealing with like the behavior modification. So, I mean, at that point, maybe they think you're too young to where that's either not going to help, or they just don't know, or maybe they don't care. I don't know. But I do know that when I finished the program, you know, my folks came out there to actually come get me. And like, you know, like a lot of situations before, they're just like, you know, your son is like such a good guy. And he's like, you know,
he played the game.
He has all these leadership skills, and, you know, like all the other kids looked up to him. And my mom, who kind of always was like hip to my bullshit, was just like, fuck, like
it didn't work.
Fooled you, you know, like he fooled you guys. And my dad's like, that's my son, you know? Yeah. You know? And, so I get out of there, and not even a week later, I was like in a blackout drunk at the high school football game, with some friends, not even a week after this program, right? Which must have just been heartbreaking for especially my dad. And I was like, got into wasn't even at like normal school. This is the Friday night football game, right?
Oh, wow.
This wasn't even during like regular school. And I had like gotten into an altercation with like a football dad guy, you know what I mean? Over couldn't even tell you what it was about, and then tried to like run once like remember back in high school they'd have like the people who would watch the parking lot. You know what I mean?
Yeah. The guy on the gator.
Right, exactly. Right. And he would also like they'd also be patrolling the Friday night football games and stuff like in the and I was trying to run from him and just like went down, like just fell, passed out drunk. I came to in like the principal's office to, you know, my first bout of like alcohol poisoning, throwing up in his trash can, trying to explain to him that I only had one and that it was a big mistake. And so, you know, woke up, like literally had to go to the hospital. This was a week back from like my 5-month program. I'm like in a blackout drunk, have to go to the hospital for alcohol poisoning, and then like expelled from from my freshman year, right? At the same time. So needless to say, my parents were not pleased, you know, at this whole situation. And I like, you know, that was probably one of the first times where like I had overshot the mark, really not trying to, you know?
Right.
Like I knew that I'd just like sort of gotten the heat off, right? And it would probably be good to just sort of like keep a low profile and, you know what I mean? Just kind of get high a little bit on the down low and not do anything too crazy. And here I am a week later, just blackout drunk, big mess, you know, expelled from school.
So was that the first time you realized that you had a problem?
I mean, I didn't look at it like it was like actually a problem. To me, the rationalization was just like I kind of overshot the mark and it was a little mistake and I went a little too hard, you know?
Right.
But did I have a problem? Yeah. I mean, yeah, but it's still, I mean, even at that point, it still seemed kind of like innocent,
right?
Fun kid stuff. And I think it's the same thing. Depends on who you hang out with, right? Because if it was like the kids that grew up in my neighborhood, that would be like the end of their life, you know? Right. For me, that was just like, you know, my friends are kind of getting expelled here and there all the time. So it was like, oh, you're going to that school now? Yeah, cool. Like, you know, so-and-so was like, yeah, so-and-so's over there right now. He'll take care of you, hook you up. So that's what happened. Apparently like the school district that I grew up in, they thought that if you get expelled from school, especially if drugs or alcohol involved, if they just transfer you to another high school.
That's what happened with me as well.
Right. They just think like you're gonna like, you know, hang out with all the really, you know, good kids, join the, you know, debate team and maybe play hockey or something like that. And you're going to straighten up and fly right. And I did the exact opposite. I found all the same kids at that school that were like my friends back there. Now it's just more networked and had like a whole network of kids, like, you know, through different districts, which was also like did amazing things for like playing music. Right. Cause I got recruited into my first kind of like real band at like 13. And now I was like going to a different school and playing music with like different, you know, kids across the district. And so now I kind of had like a little network going, you know, and it was easier to kind of like find the party or, you know, different chicks to hang out with, you know, from like across the district. And so what should have been like this really big, I don't know, it should have been some negative reinforcement for the bad behavior turned into like, you know, positive reinforcement for horrible behavior, which, you know, I kind of thrived on at that point.
So when did you realize that you had a problem?
I think it was really like playing in the band. Music became really important. It took a front seat to me, like wanting to get high and like party for a period of time, right? For like a year or two. And I got really serious about playing music, and I was in this band and we got like a little kind of like indie record deal. And I was like 15 years old. You know what I mean? By this time I'd kind of like done a year across like the other district and like I was coming back now. And then another one of my friends started introducing me to like speed, right? Speed and cocaine at a young age, mixed with like different things. And like back in the day, it was like we could go, if you remember back then, right? Growing up in San Diego, you could go to Mexico and like it was like funny, you know what I mean? It was funny to be 14, 15 years old, take the trolley, go walk across the border, like at the turnstile. And, you know, you could go.
They didn't ID you on the way there.
No. Or, and like, it took like maybe like a library card as far as a form of ID in order to get back like over the border. It just wasn't like it was today, you know? And it was sort of like known that like, if you're 14, 15, 16 years old, you're going down to like Tijuana, they know what you're doing down there, like you're going to drink in the bars and maybe go to like the strip clubs. And then it's like, even the border patrol guys thought it was like funny. They knew exactly what was going on. And we bring back all kinds of like silly prescription drugs, and it was like, that was the one thing that led to another. It was just like those trips back and forth from Mexico, experimenting with like different like pills and narcotics. And ultimately, like, I liked uppers, you know what I mean? I like going fast, and that worked well with the type of music that like I was playing. And then it was some point like around 15 years old where the drugs became as important as everything else. And then ultimately they became more important as everything else.
And that was at 15?
Yeah, 15 years old, 15 turning 16. And finally, like I was at summer, and birthday's in June. So the summer that I turned 16, that was like when the band, because we were like getting shows, and we were playing with some bands that have become like sort of really well known. This is like late 90s. Everybody knows Blink-182. Those guys were like 3 and 4 years ahead of us at the high school that I went to. We had a lot of the same kind of friends, and some of the bands that are more well known now were like, in and around San Diego that we were like playing with, and we were coming up, and like we kind of had a shot with like a Little Deal, and like I was just out of my mind getting like high, and drunk, and just raging, because it was like that was the part that I fell in love with the punk rock scene, was just being like hardcore, rigorous, like in your face, like truth, going fast, hard, and not giving a fuck. And like I loved it, and I thrived on it. And I thought that everyone in my band was kind of on the same page, but they weren't. They're actually trying to be musicians. You know what I mean? Like make a life out of doing this. And like I didn't get the memo. I was like the youngest and craziest kid like in the band, and they were looking at me like more as like a liability. I came into that band playing like bass and guitar, and then I was singing for this band, and we'd be going to shows, which was always crazy too, because we play in bars. I'm like 15 years old, like playing like as a punk rock, so not a nice bar. You know what I mean? Like, and I'm like 15 years old, like in this loud like punk rock band, just being nuts, like high out of his mind, like getting everyone in trouble, starting fights with people way bigger than me, hanging out. And finally, like my bandmates just had enough, and they were just like, dude, you're out. Like, we can't do this anymore. I think it all came to a head. Like, we were trying to record like our first album, and we were like 6 songs like into like a 12-song album, and like I just couldn't show up, like I just couldn't get it together enough to like show up and do the recordings. And like I got some of it tracked. It's interesting. Like later in life, one of those people I kind of reconnected with, and they got me the first 6 songs, and like looking back on it now, God, it sounded so bad. It was horrible. And I could totally understand why they kicked me out of the band at like that point. But they just had enough. Right. And when they kicked me out of the band, I couldn't understand it. I was trying to be like super hardcore and like punk rock. I was like bought into it. That was like my manifesto. I didn't really care for like religion or spirituality. My manifesto was just sort of like the all-encompassing truth of like punk rock music and everything that it stood for, which taught me everything. It's not all bad. There's a lot of good things that like I learned coming up in that. Some of it like I misinterpreted. A lot of it I misinterpreted, and some of it like I just took like too literally, and that was it. Once I got kicked out of the band, that was kind of like, that was everything that meant anything to me at that point. And just remember, right? So I'm barely 16 years old. Like, what do you have when you're 16? Like you kind of have your thoughts, your room, your music collection. Maybe if you're like lucky, you got a car. And that's it. That's your life. For me, it was like my band. That was my identity. That was like my life. And that was everything that was important to me. And like now I'd lost it. And so I was just like, I just said, fuck it at that point, that was like when I really kicked into high gear with like the drugs and like the criminal.
So you weren't even in full steam. You weren't even full steam ahead at that point. Right.
Well, I mean, I was, but like I was, and the distraction was that like I had like a band and people that like needed to sober me up for like at some point. And I was still trying to like kind of keep school going at that point, and my grades good enough. It's like when my parents didn't get in my shit a lot so I could like go out and play with the band, right? That was kind of the whole thing. The motivation to go to school, the motivation to show up for school because I could care less, right? Was so that my parents, like if the grades were okay enough, my folks wouldn't give me a hard time to go play with the band, meaning that I was at a point where I wasn't really going to listen and do it like anyway, but it was just easier to kind of show up to school, appease them, you know, so I didn't get any flack to go do what I wanted to do. And ultimately, when I lost that, I just stopped caring. You know, I just stopped caring that I could care less about going to school. I could care less about, you know, trying to regulate the drug and alcohol intake at that point. I just stopped caring, you know, and I'd already been through so much at that point between, you know, I had a best friend, that same year kill himself, with a gun. And, you know, drugs were kind of getting serious, right? After getting kicked out of the band, what I'd sort of been through before, the type of friends that like I had, their home life and situations was just like, things were getting very real, you know, like the kids that I grew up with, like it wasn't uncommon for them to come, you know, with like black eyes or bruises because like their dads were beating them at home. If there was some like sexual assaults going on, it's like they weren't really talking about it, but like you could tell the signs were there. And like we were in dangerous situations now. And I got into selling drugs because that was the only way to kind of keep the habit sort of going without stealing money from my parents, because what other way do you have to get money when you're 16 years old? And that brought us down to, you know, parts of Southeast San Diego, trying to explain to Mexican gangbangers that I could sell drugs in a rich, like a wealthier, whiter part of the county that they wouldn't be able to go into without getting pulled over and like arrested, you know, and doing deals with like straight up drug dealers, you know, at like 13, 14, 15, really like more 15, 16 years old. And so I was getting into some heavy stuff. Life went from like this sort of like lighthearted punk rock, have fun, you know.
What brought you down to Southeast San Diego? Like, how did you end up there?
So I was at a friend named John, and he had like a cousin that lived down there, and you know, they're like kind of like in the hood, and we were just hanging out one night. I don't know. I just remember like the new Slipknot album came out, and like we were just rocking out, and he was like, "Hey man, let's go see my cousin." So we end up in Southeast San Diego, like a really rough part of town, and like we are, you know, I think we're outside, just kind of like just hanging out in front of the house, and like we get sort of like shaken down by these like Mexican gangbangers, right? And you know, they're like, what are you doing here? Like, where are you from? What set you trying to claim? And I explain to them in the best way that I can that I'm just like, hey, you know, you could jump us right now and get 30, 40 bucks off us. So like, or I, you know, it's like, if you've got a real connect, it's like, I can make you guys some like serious money, right? This is my first,
this is your entrepreneurial mind
kicked in, right? Because and again, right, it was all for selfish motivations of like, how can I get what I want, you know? And that conversation, you know, my friend John was impressed because we didn't get the shit kicked out of us like that night, which was cool. But I was now really more focused on the fact that like, you know, hey man, we can, you know, now I can like pipeline, you know, as much, could get my hands on like a lot of really good drugs. And I was like, and we'll 10x our money because like, you know, I can get them into parts of areas that they can't, and like just charge more money. And that was like how I made the switch from like, you know, punk rock lead singer in a fledgling band, barely on an indie label, to like cocaine dealer
at 16,
you know? Yeah. At 16 years old. And really the motivation was it wasn't to get rich or make money or get into business. It was just to get free drugs. You know what I mean? To cover my habit. And it turned into a mini criminal organization. I had some friends that, you know, we had our hands into all kinds of different things. Like at that point, it was like switching from like one thing to the other was like having learned my lesson of just like, you need to not get caught, you know, you need to get good at lying. You need to get good at.
And so this is in the 90s.
Yeah.
And how much money do you think you were making?
Oh, I mean, it's like a couple $1,000 like a month. you know, which was basically
which was a lot of money,
which might as well have been, you know, $1 million when you're like 16 years old. You can't even spend $5,000, $6,000, $7,000, $8,000. You buy all the dumb shit that like at 16-year-old kid, I bought a motorcycle. We'd go to the desert. You know what I mean? We go wild out down in like Tijuana. We like we had trucks, you know what I mean? So you get like lifts and stuff.
I bought
for
a
your trucks.
72 Ford Maverick.
Yeah. Nice.
Beater, but it was fun.
Yeah. Nice. Or, and just do stuff like that, right? Like buy all kinds of like explosives, take them out to the desert, blow stuff up. You know, that was like the other part of like living in San Diego. They've got, being a Southern California kid, you know, there's lots of different ways that you could go. If you're into skiing and snowboarding, you can go to the mountains. If you're into surfing, the beach is there. If you're into wilding out down in Mexico, then, you know, Mexico's 45 minutes away. And if you want to go out to the desert to shoot guns and blow shit up, then there's like a whole desert 45 minutes like right to the east. I partook in all of those things, you know?
So when did it all come to a head?
So it all came to a head at 16 years old. I get a knock on, we get a forceful knock on the door. No, let me back up. I'm in my truck, right, with all my overpriced parts for that I've been buying with the proceeds from my mini cocaine empire, and I'm like, you don't even, if you remember back when like you got your first license when you're 16, it's like a, what do they call it, like a provisional license or something, like you're not supposed to drive in the car with like certain people or whatever. So I have like, you know, 3 people in the car, girlfriend at a time, and I'm probably on a lot of Vicodin. This is before Oxycontin, you know, thank God. Thank God this is before. I'm convinced we could talk about this later on, but if like Oxycontin and fentanyl was like a thing back then, I 1000% would be dead. 10 times over, which makes the whole landscape very scary this day and age. But anyway, I was best case scenario, I was like high, probably not drinking that day, but definitely high in like driving around the truck with like other people in it that shouldn't have been there. And I was coming down from East like San Diego, and some guy was, you know, trying to race me. And it was like one of those things where, you know, it goes into one lane, sort of zips into one lane. And so we both hit it, and you know, I kind of get out in front of him, and like I'm not stopping, and like the front of like his bumper hooks like the back of like the truck, and he goes in oncoming traffic, and he hits another car, which ended up being like a mom with like some kids in the car. And so I'd caused this accident high, and the 2 other people that I had with me, you know, were just like were obviously freaking out, and I took off. Right. I was scared. I just left. I didn't know how bad it was. All I know is that, you know, I was a part of this, and I left. So I left the scene. You know, a couple days later, because it's just like, you think about, it's funny if you ever watch like a crime show where like something bad happens, and like there's that moment where like you could stop the car, you could go and see what happened, you could turn yourself in, right? Like all of these different scenarios that you play back in your head where like if you went back, it could have been different. And it's like interesting watching a TV show play out like that, because like I did that where I made the worst decisions, you know what I mean? Like I just left and told them that, you know, told my friends that they couldn't talk about it. And, you know, if you watch any show where something bad has happened like that, if there's more than one person that was like there,
it comes back.
Someone's going down, you know what I mean? Like someone's going to talk at that point. And before that even got to that point, I'm sure someone like some passerby probably got a partial license plate. They put it together, and 2 days later, you know, the police are like on my doorstep, like arresting me for this hit and run. And, you know, luckily and thank God at this day, and I still thank God this day, that no one was seriously injured like in that accident. You know, spent days in the hospital, but like it's just one of those brushes with death. That didn't make me feel any better at the time, and I wasn't really in a place where I was like remorseful. The mentality was trying to get away with it. You know, the mentality was more criminal. It was not empathetic or sympathetic. I was only upset at that point because I'd gotten caught. I wasn't upset because I actually caused harm to people. You know, I really didn't have that capacity yet. And I was still like a total loss and a disregard for my own life, let alone other people. And, you know, they brought me to jail. I'd been to juvenile hall like once or twice before. And, you know, what I'd come to find out is that in addition to this felony hit and run that that they had now charged me with, that they had kind of like raided my folks' house because they had been building a case against me and some of my associates, my friends, because of the amount of like illicit narcotics that were coming into that part of like San Diego at the time, as well as some insurance fraud that we had gotten ourselves in, some theft of some golf carts from a local golf course that I had gotten myself in. And by the time it was like all...
So you were running the racket.
Yeah, we had our hands in like a bunch of different things. Yeah, I had some friends that... I had some friends from across town where that were like into cars. I've always been into cars. It's kind of like second passion behind like music, and you know, that was like the thing at the time. You'd like sort of soup up like your Honda Civics. This is like, you know, circa Fast and Furious number 1 came out, right? And everybody's like into imports, and so there's like a big aftermarket for parts. We knew a guy across town that could make the car disappear. You make the insurance claim, right, with all the add mods on it to it, and you'd cash in on that and then sell your mods off to the side. That was like a little business that we found ourselves into. And then obviously like drugs was fun at the time. And then just like kind of like good old fashioned, just like, you know, thefts, you know, breaking in and stealing stuff. And like in the wealthier part of towns, like no one ever seemed to call the police about it because they had insurance and they just, you know what I mean? Yeah. They'd take it up. So it seemed like a real victimless crime. Anyway, they'd been building a case, you know, like against not just me, but like I don't know, 10 of us were named in like the case, and like when I got out that time, and you know, that was like coming off like the first time that I'd actually like OD'd, and the first time like I OD'd, and then all of this like happened after that, and you know,
so you OD'd
right
before
this happened, like leading up into that, sort of was able to like not, that one was able
was
to
that
like
speed
done. Yeah. And done sort of like handled without my parents like knowing anything about it. And then the second time, which happened after all this, because it wasn't just the felony hit and run. It was like, I had some serious charges. Like at this point, it was like, it was that felony hit and run. It was like 2 counts of grand theft. It was like 2 counts of withholding stolen property, you know, possession with intent to sell. It was like 5 felonies and multiple misdemeanors. And, you know, my parents at this point were like just stunned, I think was the word. I think that the second time I OD'd, I actually ended up in the hospital. And it was shortly after all this happened, I'd got raided and like in charge with all these things. And I was in a very, very, very dark place, hence the overdose, not knowingly trying to kill myself, but like not really caring. You know what I mean? If like that were going to be the outcome, it was sort of just like.
And how old were you at this point?
16.
So you were still 16.
Yeah.
So all this was going on in a period of what, 3 years?
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yeah. Really.
That's insane.
Things escalated very quickly. So, waking up in the hospital that second time, second OD, waking up in the hospital that first time with my parents there. What was different about it this time was just like, I'd already sort of like, I've seen them angry, I've seen them upset, you know, I've seen them really pissed off. This time, like the look was different. It was a look of indifference, right? It was a look of like the parents that I've seen, you know, who've got kids that are just like running through the ringer, where they're just like, they're past the point of like, I don't know what to do anymore. They sort of like, you know, I love this kid, but he's like killing us. You know what I mean? It's like, I can't watch this anymore. And that look of indifference really had an effect on me. It had a pivotal effect on me at 16 years old, that second time waking up, because it was like they were just waiting for me to die. Like ultimately they'd come to some, whether it was conscious or subconsciously, they just sort of knew that like there was nothing that they could do, and they were just like watching a train wreck, and it was just a matter of time before like I died. And so instead of getting like upset, you know, angry, invested, telling me that they loved me and they cared, they just had a look of indifference. You know what I mean? Like, what are we going to do with you now? And that had a very drastic effect on me. And for the first time, like I woke up the next day, you know, after I was home, knowing that I was just in in a real pile of shit, that I'd created for myself, wanting to just like, being in that place of just like too scared to like kill myself, not being old enough to really do anything about it, anyway. And just everything that I had like done up into that point, just like didn't work, and, here I was at like 16 with like all these legal charges, barely like in high school, like at this point, kicked out of like my band, which was like the only thing that I had going for me, and just, no real prospects, and like, and bridges were burned. Even my friends were just like, you can't hang out. Like their parents were like, you can't come hang out here anymore. Yeah. Like you're done. You're not welcome here. I had my kids from the bad side of town saying like, my mom said like, we can't hang out anymore. Like you're too much heat on you, bro. Like you can't come around anymore. And I just like, I'm lucky that this happened at an age before things were out of hand, completely out of hand, but I was still young, and I think
what was the result of those charges?
So, yeah, I mean, I'll explain it. Before we got to like the result of what ultimately happened in those charges, what happened was, I went to my parents and I said like, look, I want to change, I want to do it differently. I don't know what to do. I know I've asked for help before and like didn't mean it. And I'm not asking to like go to a program. I really want help, and I'm in a bad way and I don't know what to do, and they had got me back in touch with an old drug and alcohol interventionist, like a clinician that I had met, when I was 13, the first time I started going to ILP, or my first experience in like going to a 12-step meeting that it obviously didn't take. And I wasn't ready at that point, but I had met him, and I called him up and I reached out to him and I was like, hey, I'm serious. Like I want help. I'm in a lot of trouble. I'm done. And he's like, all right, well, he's like, I got a place for you and we leave tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
He said, can you be ready? I was like, yeah, figuring I had no other prospects and nothing else to lose. And so the next day, that was December, 2020 would have been my junior year of like high school. I left San Diego and went to a recovery house in
December 2000.
Yeah, 2000. That's what I mean, not 2020.
Yeah.
Just say 2020. No, December 2000, right? December 20th, 2000.
Okay.
I left with my mom and my brother and got dropped off at a recovery house in Gardena back in Los Angeles. And I've been sober ever since then.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
So what happened in that instance that changed?
Well, so I knew that, I didn't know that there was any young people getting sober. I also didn't know a whole lot of young people that were in the amount of like trouble that I was in. Even speaking with my attorney at like 16, he explained to me like, in his best attorney lingo that it's just like, hey, look, what you have going for you is you don't have any prior like offenses, but you have like the amount of charges here that it's not like you got caught smoking weed or stealing beer from the grocery store. He's like, you're part of a criminal enterprise. The only thing you guys have going for you is like, you're all not 18 yet. That's it. Beyond that, he's like, this is bad. I don't know if I can keep you out of jail. And he's like, best case scenario, you're going to do, about 18 months. And like half that's going to be like at a real state prison, because you're going to be past 18 and you're not going to be a juvenile anymore.
So it took about 2 years for this to come to a head. Well,
I mean, it was, the charges were filed at 16. I also got sober very shortly after that. The me wanting to get sober was not, I'd be lying if I told you it wasn't to try to figure out like a path of how to get out of like those legal charges, but it was really trying to figure out a path of how to like fix my life, period, because it was just completely broken and a mess. And I was scared, like those, I'm sure I owed those good fellas from Southeast San Diego some money, I owed a lot of people like money. I had burned a lot of bridges like at that point. My parents definitely made it very clear that they didn't care. I wasn't 18 years old. Like I wasn't welcome back at the house once I left for rehab, that this is the last thing that they were going to do to help me. And then I was completely on my own. And I was ready for a change. I was really ready for a change. I didn't know what like getting sober in an AA or 12-step program consisted of. I didn't make a conscious decision like I was going to never drink or get high again. That's kind of what I found out to be the way that you do it, but I was sort of open at that age for whatever the experience was. And when I ended up at this recovery house up in LA, what I found was that there's a bunch of guys there that were my age that had been through a lot of similar stuff, and they were all staying sober, and that recovery house like got me out to a couple meetings, and I started going to meetings in LA, and I met like a bunch of people that were my age, who could, and that was what struck me is when I sat in the first couple of those meetings that these people in the meetings were articulating extremely well exactly how I felt, and I realized that my need to like get out of my own mind and like where all that started was just like a feeling of inadequacy or like wanting to fit in, and all the trouble that came with it was just like me being crazy. It was me trying to like fill some void that, one sort of too much and 1,000 is never enough. That was trying to fill that void. And I felt like I was like, man, for the first time in my life, after all the therapy I'd been through and everything that I've been through, it's funny how just like sitting in just a run-of-the-mill AA meeting, like I identified very exactly with like how these people were like feeling. And so that's when I learned that I was just like, yeah, it's not so much, maybe it is, maybe it wasn't necessarily ADHD, maybe it wasn't bipolar, maybe it wasn't clinical depression. It was a garden variety alcoholic drug addict. You just can't call a 13-year-old kid that,
Right.
It's hard to put that label on somebody who's only been like drinking for a year or two. Most people think of like alcoholism. They think of like how I thought about people who were alcoholics. They're like, homeless in their 60s and then look like they're 80, drinking Mad Dog 2020 out of a paper bag,
right?
Next to like a trash can fire to stay warm in like Detroit. That's how I thought of like alcoholics, right? It didn't occur to me that that you could stop drinking or getting high at like such a young age, and then getting sober in this recovery house, I found like a bunch of people that are my age doing it, and that gave me not only like a lot of hope and encouragement and faith that I could do it myself, but like I saw that there was like people here that were actually doing it and their lives were getting good, and they were exactly like me. And that gave me hope. And that hope and that encouragement allowed me to like, put together like a month or two and then like make a commitment to stay in this recovery house. And getting back to like those charges, what ultimately happened was that about 6 months into the recovery house, I was going in for an arraignment because the attorney that my folks had gotten me was able to get the case like pleaded down to something that was still going to require me to go to jail for a period of time, but not, we're talking like maybe a year. And I do like another 3 months in like a state prison. And, I'd been in this recovery house for 6-7 months and, met a sponsor, and I was into working the steps. And like, I'd believed for the first time in my life that I found a way out of it. And now I was going to have to like go to jail for a while. And I remember going to court, getting ready to go to court, like the day before this arraignment, and, just crying, just totally crying and just being completely upset because I'd been through all this before now. And I finally found like my people and like a way out to like live like a clean and sober life. And like, now I knew that I needed to go back. It's a part of the program. You got to go back and you have to make amends. That's like one of the steps in the program. And so I knew that I needed to do this, right, to make it right and to be honest. But at the same time, I was like really scared and nervous about the fact that I was going to have to like, you do the opposite of that. It's like everything that I've learned in like recovery is like you get vulnerable. You talk about your feelings, like you talk about like where you come from, the things that you're struggling with. And if you've ever been to jail before, that's the complete opposite of what you do there.
Right.
You get real tough. You get really hard because you have to survive there, and I was like really upset about having to go back to that, getting into the mindset that that's what I was going back to. And so, I left and I went down to court. My dad picked me up early, got me from LA and took me into court and sat there with with the judge and the attorney, and they read out all the charges and all the horrible things that like I did, and they said they've come to a plea agreement. Mr. Wolf, how do you plead? And I'm guilty. Like I did all that and more. And he's like, well, what do you have to say to yourself? I'm just like I'm told him like what I was doing with my life at that point. I said it wasn't a ploy. It wasn't just to look good. That, all that I asked after I get sentenced is that you allow me to return to this recovery house to finish there because I don't know what else to do. This is the only thing that I really have going on for the only place that I felt safe from like myself. And, I totally did everything that you did. I'm extremely remorseful. And, I'm willing to pay my debt to society. Just all that I ask is you let me go back and finish the time at the recovery house whenever I finish, wherever
at this time. And at this point, you are remorseful at that for all of that, right? You've
because I'd come to the side. Yeah, I'd come around to the other side of it and realize, after like a lot of it is just kind of being like in the middle of it at the same time. After about a month, you kind of like you physically sort of like your body gets like out all the drugs and you start thinking clear for the first time in like a long time. It had been literally since like, besides the stint in a 30-day rehab at like 14 and the time out in the mountains at like 13 years old, I've been high that entire time. Like I never came down. Maybe I'd go days, but like never more than really like a week and a half. And, after seeing that, being in the recovery house, starting work, like getting into like the steps and like getting into recovery, not only did I feel like I fit in, like I really bought into it. You know what I mean? I was like, I saw very clearly at a young age that I was just like, there's nothing else for me, right? It's like I either do this or it's jails, institutions, or death. And like I'd already been that close to death. I'd been in institutions before and I was looking at going to jail, and like I had all the isms that they were talking about there. So I think that's why I got it at such a young age. I don't know a lot of folks that get sober like that young, but it all had happened to me, and like everybody that I'd sort of encounter in meetings and in recovery, it was just like, you just managed to do everything that it took me 30 years to do what you managed to do in like 3.5, 4 years, and so knowing what you know now, it's like, I was always kind of like, I wasn't stupid, I was always kind of a smart kid. Like I could read people, I understood how things work, and I saw the writing on the wall very clearly that like, this was it. And as I got into the steps and understood like what I did, I felt not only extremely remorseful, but just like sad and guilty, knowing that I'd have to go make amends for all these things.
Right. So now you're sitting in front of the judge.
Right. And I'm explaining all this to him, and he calls me back in his chambers and he says, Mr. Wolf, I've been doing this for a long time. And he's like, you fall into like one of two categories, but he said like, look, like I said, I've been doing this for a long time. And he's like, you either mean everything that you say, and you're going to change for the better, and you're going to ultimately like help a lot of people out and do some great things with your life. He's like, or you are a sociopathic criminal. And you really belong in an institution, you belong in a prison cell. And, I didn't really know how to take that. So I was just like kind of in the back of my head thinking like, so. And
so you're in the chamber, you have your lawyer there?
No, he's just talking to me one-on-one.
So it's just you?
Just me and the judge. And he said, like, look, he said, my gut feeling tells me that, like, you're one of the handful of kids that I really believe like what you're saying. So I'm going to give you a second chance, and I'm going to let you go back. He said, I'm going to let you go back to your program voluntarily, and we're going to, he's like, I'm going to seal the record, pending that you stay sober, and you're going to have a second chance on life. It's not going to follow you. You're not going to have a felony. Like, you're going to be able to literally go back into society as if none of this happened, as long as you stay sober, and I never see you in my courtroom ever again. And if I do, you will not get out of prison until you're 30 years old. And,
good thing you're past that point now.
Right. Well, walking out of there kind of astonished, think about that, right? And I've discussed this with, guys that have done some serious time in like prison before, but like, just the change of like walking in that building with the mindset that I'm leaving here in handcuffs and a jumpsuit, to leaving there like with my freedom, no charges, not even probation. You know what I mean? Nothing, like sealed, like not even in the contract where it wasn't just like, you can finish your program voluntarily. And I think the thinking behind the judge was just like, if I really didn't mean it and they were going to I was just going to dodge it and duck out on the whole thing, that I would be back there.
And then he was going to be able to catch you up.
Right. And so there wasn't even a contingency where it was like, I needed to stay at the recovery house. It was just like, you're free. You know what I mean? I'm going to give you a second chance. I believe what you said, let's see if you do the right thing. And I walked out of that courtroom just like free, no charges, no record of it, completely sealed, as a minor, wouldn't follow me like into college or anything like that. And I went back to the recovery house and like, I felt like that was like my one. I think in life you like get a second chance, you know what I mean, at some point. And that was it, and it just happened like at a young age. Like that was like a pivotal moment, like in a life-defining, like, a life-defining thing that happened to me at that moment in time where I knew how valuable that was.
So now you're sitting here in a recovery house and you're free and clear. You don't have any of that hanging over you, and you have some options in front of you.
Yeah. And
so take me from there into, was everything else fails, was that before or after?
What all else fails? Yeah. No, that was after. That was after I got out of the recovery house. I met a group of guys. One of them was my sponsor, like in the program. And, I started going to this meeting, like a men's meeting up in Beverly Hills. And unbeknownst to me and not knowing like the caliber of like men that were like a part of this group, they took me under their wing and they really gave me like a leg up. They're the ones who motivated me to, like I didn't even know how to tie like a tie, let alone like, put together a resume or go to a job or even work a job. Never had like a real
job. You're not welcome at home.
Yeah, not yet. I mean, okay. Better. It was better. Like as I was getting through, I love my parents to death. They would come up and they were like active in my recovery. Right. So they would come up like every weekend and participate in like their groups. And, I'd lived in that recovery house till I was just shy of like 18 years old. So I was there for a year and a half, almost 2 years. And over that year and a half, 2 years, I mended that relationship with my parents. But like that trust had been broken and so violated that it took years to gain it back. But by the time I'd, was getting close to like being sober for 2 years and had gotten out of the recovery house, I was working a job, living on my own. I got like an apartment I was living at in LA and still actively involved in like the program and the recovery house. And like, I'd met these gentlemen like that were more senior to me and they really took me under their wing, and they motivated me to work and get a job and, go back to school and got me set up like in the first business that I ever got into. And I mean, God, like they really just like put me on a fast track. Like at some point it's just like,
what were their names?
Mike Watson in particular was really like second call, like a second dad to me, sponsor like in AA, and just like a whole group of guys. Like there was a whole group of guys and like, there was so much help, whether it was like a little or a lot from so many guys, that it was like, I'd ended up at this meeting because like I ended up at that particular meeting in this recovery house because like I failed at life, like I'd burned everything down.
Right.
And I went from a point where I was like about to, looking at going to jail for like years. So like now I'm hanging out with like these guys that, are 10, 15 years older than me, more experienced, that are like helping me out and giving me like, I don't know, masterclass lessons in like how to live life, and the wisdom of like the ages that they've gained like from over the years. And they just did it because that's what was done for them, when their life sort of fell apart. And I mean, a lot of that's just luck. A lot of that I think is just like, knowing that I had an opportunity there and that these men were like willing to help me out, and just like soaking up everything that they told me to do, and knowing that this is my second chance, going back to like the judge and kind of getting my life handed back to me. I knew that was my second chance, and like I wasn't going to fuck that up. I knew that that it didn't need to be wasted, and these guys would say like, yeah, whatever. So like you're cool. You're 17, almost 18 years old now, and you got sober for a couple of years. You're lucky to have gotten it. That's a gift to get it at that age. So what are you going to do with it now? It wasn't going to be okay with them for me to work like a remedial job and just like sort of fuck off. You know what I mean? Like I surfed, right? So I'd like surfing, and part of me was just like, yeah, I just kind of surf and hang out and work this little job and live in an apartment. Like none of these guys were like okay with it. They're just like, you've already been through so much. You're so young. You've got your whole life ahead of you. Like you got to go to school. You got to start businesses. You got to just like do something big. And so these guys were like really, really motivated me to think bigger, think a lot bigger.
Getting back into, well, you were up north,
right,
with all the guys. You've basically gone from not fitting in, not feeling like you fit in, to now you're overwhelmed with the amount of people that you fit in with.
Right. Yeah. And I'm living in this little apartment that I'm splitting with like, two other guys. Right. I think the rent was like $1,200 a month. We lived behind like it felt like I think it was like an Asian like call girl bar, like in Torrance. And I worked at Chipotle, and I would take the bus. I didn't even have a car. I'd like take the bus down Crenshaw Boulevard to like work this late shift at Chipotle. And I was like 17 years old at the time, and all I really wanted to do is get a job at Guitar Center. So I went in on my birthday. I think I might have even told you this story before. I was like sometime when I was like 17, I went to go try to get a job at Guitar Center because I was like, man, what job could be better? I hang out and like play guitar and do music stuff like all day. And that sounds awesome. So I'd go in there and I'm like, hey, I used to play in a band. I'm really good. I'll show up to work on time. Like I'll do really good here. And they're like, that's great, but you're like 17. We can't hire you until you're 18. I was like, okay, well, what if I come back on like when I turn 18? He said, look, you come back on your manager, right, at the Guitar Center, like in Lawndale, California, was like, if you come back on your he's like, you come back when you're 18. He's like, you're all right. We'll give you a job. So the day I turned 18, on my 18th birthday, I walked back into that Guitar Center and I said like, hey, I'm 18. Can I have the job? And the guy was sort of like, his mind was blown. Like he thought he was never going to see me again. And I got hired at Guitar Center, working on like the guitar floor, like selling guitars, which to me, I thought was like the coolest job at the time, being like 18 years old. Didn't really pay shit. But it was a job, and it was allowing me to like sort of live on my own and fend for myself. And, I was surrounded by these men, and they're just like, you gotta go back to school. So while I'm working at Guitar Center, they write me like, or I'm sorry, I was like, I had no way to pay for it. And I didn't want to ask my parents for any more help, right? I wasn't going to take any more of their money. That was like part of my living amends to them. I was going to do it on my own. So I'm like, I'm working, living in a shitty apartment. I'm like taking the bus to work into my little job. I finally find like a little, beat up old like Acura Integra. And I get a little car, and then I'm going to community college at El Camino Junior College, and don't know how I'm going to pay for that. So one of the guys, one of my mentors is just like, we'll see if you can apply for scholarships. So start looking through all the scholarships, and there's one, it's like a persuasive speech contest. So I write a speech, and like I give this formal speech, and I win a scholarship at El Camino Junior College, and they cover like my first year books and tuition and everything. So I'm like working at Guitar Center, and now I'm like going to junior college, and I won a scholarship, and part of like one of the sort of catches to that scholarship is like I have to join their debate team, right? Their speech and debate team. So I'm on the El Camino Junior College speech and debate team, working at this Guitar Center in Lawndale, and the guys that I'm hanging out with are just like, they're motivating me to do more. They're like, what else are you into? Like you could start a business, you could do whatever you want, like the world is yours. You could do whatever you want. So I'm still kind of playing music at the time. more independently and like and solo, and I'm still going to like a lot of shows. Like music has always like been a big part of my life, and I got the idea of like doing merchandising for local bands in LA, and ultimately started my first company, which is called All Its Failed Industries, and it specialized in making merchandise for pretty much it was all punk rock bands, like from South Bay, California. And then ultimately in LA, and like that was even more, it was sort of an upgrade from my Guitar Center job, because I love that job at Guitar Center, and shout out to Guitar Center, because like that's literally it. I mean, look, it's at the end of the day, it's a sales job,
Right.
but you get to sell something that you're passionate about, and you get to hang out and like talk, music and shop like all day long, and that's most of like who works at Guitar Center. They're young, aspiring musicians. It's the it's the equivalent of like being a waiter or a bartender as an aspiring actor. I think
Right.
like working at Guitar Center as an aspiring musician, and so that was a fun place to hang out. And when I got into like designing merchandise for bands, it was something that felt like just like a natural progression and easy. So merchandise is usually what before you get a record deal. If you're a band and you're just like making it, you're all working normal jobs. And if you are going to go on the road, right, there's no record company that's bankrolling your tours. So therefore you you have to sell merchandise in order to like pay for the hotel, and for food and for gas for like the van to keep it going. What the venues usually pay, especially if you're, not that well known of a band or like don't have a following, is like minuscule, and like really like your make or break of like, whether the tour is going to go the distance or end is like based on your merchandise. And so I figured out a way to consolidate, the making of this merchandise to give all the bands access to more gear, because a lot of these guys are like musicians, right? They don't have like, usually, I don't know if you ever been to like shows or, growing up in the punk rock scene, there's like two shirts, one color,
Right.
a guy to girls, maybe.
Yeah.
They only have triple extra large left, right? And they're out of everything else.
That's
it. And so I was like, I figured out a way to do, if I do bulk ordering in the sizes that like most of the bands like want, and I consolidate, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12 bands like at the same time. And I'm the one that's like sort of helping them out, do all their designs and everything like that. The money that I save in purchasing and getting all this manufactured in bulk, I can pass that along to the bands, and then I could keep them on the road. It's a good business plan for the bands, because it allowed them to get access to higher quality merchandise, a wider variety, usually better like fits, longer lasting, better material like clothing, at a more or less expensive of a price. And it sort of took a lot of the busy work like out of their hands doing it. And that was cool. I got to support a lot of these bands. I traveled on like the Warped Tour for like 2 years in a row, at least like the whole West Coast like side of it. And all of these, bands that I like idolized as like a kid growing up, I was like now meeting them all, doing like clothes for their bands and stuff. And not even necessarily doing clothes for like all the big bands I was listening to, just being able to be in the same place where I could meet them. You know what I mean?
Right.
And sort of find out these people. It was like a dream job at the time. And after doing that, from like about 18 to 20, it became kind of a grind. And like, I felt like I got like a real sort of look at what it takes to like make it, like as a band. And especially in the punk rock scene, it's like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because in order to be punk rock, you cannot sell out. Right.
Right.
And if you're not going to sell out, right, that means that you're sort of like going to play music and keep the prices and the tickets and the merch and everything like low. To what end though? You know what I mean?
Right.
Like you're basically going to live a life of poverty and like live your life on the road. And I saw a lot of these bands, and I was just like, man, this does not look all that glorious. Like these guys have been doing it for like 20 years, in some cases, and they don't really have a whole lot to show for themselves. And like they're like, these are like famous musicians. Like as far as like that scene could be known like well over the world, none of these guys are like rich. You know what I mean? None of these guys are super well off. And a lot of them have sort of come to the other side where they've been able to figure out how to like build their brand, how to do different things with like their music historically. But there's always sort of like that push and the pull of like, am I selling out? Am I selling out and like doing this? And that was like a lot to see. Plus it was like grueling being on the road. If you ever traveled with the band or like been on tour, like for a while, it was like I remember just like the work tour is just like exhausting, man. You know what I mean? It's like I think we did like 18 towns in like 25 days or something like that.
Oh,
and,
wow.
you'd sort of sleep in the, in the ride from like one town to another. And like, everybody was just like, even the like the headlining bands and that, like everyone was just tired. It was like a grind. I don't know how you do that with a family, And I think
Yeah,
like
that's brutal.
some of the guys, like, if you've ever seen what's the documentary, the other F word, it's a documentary about Jim Lindbergh from Pennywise and Fat Mike from NoFX, and talking about how they're making the transition and like becoming a father, right? And how they were like, in these hardcore punk rock bands, and they're growing up and they have these teenage kids and they have to teach these values to their kids.
Yeah.
And like, it had such an impact on me because at some point, there's a real business side to that. And, you have to make money. You know what I mean? You have to support your family, right? There's nothing glorious in being poor if you can't, support like your family and protect the people like around you. So seeing the writing on the wall and knowing that like, as fun as that was, and as like passionate as I was about that, there wasn't a whole lot of money in making band merchandise, And one of my mentors is just like, look, you're a smart guy. You've got some chops in sales. Why don't you go sell mortgages, And I'm 20. And I was like, okay. So I traded in, say what?
I said, moving on.
Yeah. So, I traded in, my my descendant shirt for a business suit, and, went in and got a job at a brokerage firm, and probably made like, my first year working at 20 years old, a friend of mine, mentor of mine, got my foot in the door in this place because I didn't, again, right? Like I didn't even own a suit, up until that point. I'd never even owned a suit. The only time that you'd ever see me in a tie is if I was going to a funeral,
Yeah.
or court, like they're just like, there was no, I just didn't have that that wasn't in my
Wardrobe.
closet.
Right.
Yeah. That just didn't exist in my wardrobe. And now here I am, like, selling financial, products, you know what I mean? For homes in a suit, like making really good money. I was like at 20 years old. Remember, I'm still in community college at this time.
2003, right? Somewhere around there?
Yeah, like 2003. Or I'm making, and I'm like probably on track before 21 to make like more than 100 grand, like that first year. And I'm just working hard, I don't really know it, but I'm like, I know I've told you this story before. My first day in the mortgage business, the boss came in, big Italian dude, and he drops like a stack of title leads, just old bad leads in front of me, and just says, see how long you get these people on the phone for. That's all he told me. Those were my only instructions. That was my first day. Oops. That was my first day in the mortgage business, was see how long you keep these people on the phone. I had no training. I didn't know exactly what we were selling. I didn't even know what to do if I found like one of these people were interested. And it was like a real boiler room type like situation. And so I just started calling, and about like, halfway through the day, after I'd made like what felt like 1,000 calls, but it was probably like a couple hundred, and people just like telling me to shut up, don't ever call it back. Like, I'm going to kill your mom. I'll slit your throat. I'll come kill your family. Like, these people did not want phone calls about this. And it sounds like that some people had been calling them like a couple times before, like they'd heard from me. And sometime around lunchtime, I asked like another colleague in there, I'm just like, wait, hey, boss told me just to call these guys, keep them on the phone. What am I supposed to do if like one of them are actually interested? And he kind of like laughs, like like the type of laugh where it's just like no one actually gets anybody interested on the first day. But he kind of laughs, and he's just like, well, he's like, you got to get a loan application, And so, I made it a goal that before I left the office that day, I was going to get somebody interested, like get a loan application. I must have made 400 calls, and sometime like around 4 or 5, like the day's closing up, people going away, and I still haven't been able to get this like done. I'm starting to get discouraged, and like, this is really hard. And then, sure enough, like I finally get someone to pick up the phone and, start a conversation. She's like, yeah, I've just been out of the country for a couple months, and I've been meaning to look at this, and, sure, let's go ahead, and what information do you need? And I'm like, I got one, freaking out. And like, they come over, help me take like a loan application that ended up being like a deal for a multi-million-dollar property like in Hermosa Beach. And
Oh, wow.
I think it paid me like somewhere around $12,000 or $13,000 like commission in getting that deal done. And it just like changed my perspective on like sales and the whole industry. It's like that concept where it's like, if I quit right before I made that phone call, that'd have been a really hard job with like not much of a payoff, but like if I stuck it in for that much longer, if you divide up like what all those calls of all the people telling me to go fuck myself and like die, you divide that by the amount of the commission, it was almost like each call where someone told me to go die was like worth $50, and like in each hour of my time that I spent that day was like in the thousands. And so, I figured out, I was just like, well, this is way easier than traveling on the road, you know what I mean? By making clothes, and like, I'm just going to do this for a while. And I was kind of hoping, because remember, I'm back at college, that they were going to kind of teach me how to do like business. I thought that's what I was going to learn at college, right? They were going to teach me how to do like sales, how to like, put a business together. And they didn't, right? And I ultimately ended up just dropping out of junior college, like my maybe second year into it. And just like went full time selling mortgages and started making quite a bit of money. And ultimately that brought me down to San Diego. I bought my first house when I was 21 years old. I moved down here. I opened up an office in Carlsbad. And, now I'm running a team of like 10 guys that are all 3, 4, 5 years older than me. And like, I'm making way more money than a 21-year-old kid should really be making at the time. And, this is like 2004, 2005 now. And, it's just like, it's easy to make money.
When do you write your first book?
Yeah. So I'd always had those other projects, and I wrote my first book. I think like right around that same time as when I got it published. I wrote it from 18 to 20, and it's called The Rich Kid Syndrome. And it was really about my life growing up. It was kind of like, I wrote that book where if I could have handed a guide to my folks of what I was going through, in my teenage years that they couldn't quite understand, that was the book. All that teenage angst with the, like we started talking on the beginning before, it's like being an upper middle class, like normal white kid from a, heterosexual standard family, where mom and dad are still together. It's like, there's no love for you like in society today. And for the same reasons of what I was experiencing, like when I was a kid, what do you do as like parents of those kids, and that was like that. I wrote the book really for them, and for other parents that were struggling with their kids, and that was my first book, the Rich Kid Syndrome, that I got published. It self-published that book. And that was a big deal for me. And again, right, I had some really good mentorship and motivation that helped me figure out how to like actually do that. But yeah, I mean, that was really cool. And I could say that by the time I turned 21, I was a published author and, making a 6-figure income homeowner, bought my first house when I was 21, and I'm living down in San Diego, and things were pretty smooth, and at the same time too, I'm making all the decisions that you could expect a 22-year-old kid who's making like $40,000 a month to make, and bought bought a really nice car and some like, really expensive clothes and watches. And I was trying to emulate and do all the things that like successful people were doing at the time. And I think this is really when I got like my lesson between like the difference between like rich and wealthy, and what I was after at that point was I made a switch and I figured out that like, money's a game, you can get good at it. It's something that it's not something that needs to be elusive. It's just, you have to figure out sort of the formula. And once you figure out the formula, then you scale it, you go harder. And I did that, and I continued to do that. And then it wasn't just one house. It was like, a house and a property, and then another house, and, then like a couple cars. And then, you figured out, then I had that first really painful experience when I turned 23 years old, and, I'm getting 1099, I'm getting paid as a 1099 contractor and running this firm. And my accountant explains that I owe $80,000 in taxes. And I'm just like, what? Hold on. Don't they take that out of my paycheck? He's like, dude, you own the business. You know what I mean? He's like, you would take it out of your own paycheck and pay it. And I'm just like, oh, and that like was a really painful experience. And it's like, again, right? Thought they were going to teach that in college. They didn't teach it. And so I'm like cutting my teeth in the business and I'm learning a lot of the things like the hard way, but I got a lot of support like along the way. And, I'm growing them and expanding that. And I'm just learning a lot about like people and, the type of friends that attracts, right? And being young and impressionable in your 20s and making a lot of money and making stupid bad investments, and attracting the wrong people around you and, realizing that, people that you thought were your good friends, as soon as you start getting just a little bit more successful than they are, they, turn into like your worst enemies and they're sort of secretly waiting for your demise. And, I got like a harsh lesson by the time I was like 23 years old, 24 years old. We're getting into 2008 and I'm very over leveraged in everything that we did. And then the whole economy collapses. And all these guys that I was like following, who were supposed to be like millionaires and super wealthy people, turns out they were wrong. Turns out they were fucking con artists, and no one knew what they were doing. And, from the years of like 2003 to 2006 and 7, I think it was like 1 out of 5 people had a real estate license, and it was not hard to make money in that business. And I thought I was super smart. Right. And it turns out I was just kind of like, I was more in the right place at the right time than I was super smart, and my whole life blew up. A lot of my identity was sort of created in the making of that money, the houses, like the cars. And again, like I wasn't like a multi-millionaire or anything like that, but I was like a self-made 24-year-old kid that was making more money than most people that were twice my age.
So what did you do when the economy collapsed? You got into, you stayed in sales, right?
Well, I was having an existential crisis because, like I'd mentioned, my identity was so wrapped up in the making of the money that when that went away so abruptly, it was like I was just super depressed. Like it brought on like just like a super like low point in my life, like deep bout of like depression, and which I'd always struggled with even after, right? Like the mental health side of like, even above and beyond like recovery and staying sober and working it, I've always struggled with like that depression. That's one thing that's like stuck with me. And, what triggers it's always, it's really elusive because obviously like my whole world fell apart like at that point. And at the same time, the mentors, like I said, it was my second dad. My sponsor was dying of like esophageal cancer. And, it was all sort of happening at the same time. And strangely enough, like right as that was like going down too, my dad, my real dad, who was like my hero, was like caught like a federal indictment for Medicaid fraud. Remember, he was a podiatrist, and this is a whole other story like in itself. Long story short, like they're going to make an example out of him. And even though he wasn't, he had not knowingly done anything super criminal, long story short, what came down to like basically a billing error. They're trying to turn it into, making him out to be like a, horrible like fraud con artist trying to con Medicaid patients out of it. And ultimately, so all this is going on, right? Like I'm having this existential crisis. I feel like I lost my identity with all the money and all the stuff that went away. My sponsors, like a father to me, is dying from cancer. And then my dad, like my real dad, looks like he's in trouble, and he ends up going to prison, federal prison for, 6 months. And so I spent like that time in my life really, I missed a part too. Before everything got really bad and I lost everything, I went back to college. I started going back to school, and I'll mention this too, because this is kind of to answer your first question. This is how I made that trip back. I was working, making all that money, and to become more of a well-rounded individual, I went back to community college, like locally here at like Miracosta, to just do things that I was interested about. I was taking classes on like web design, like guitar, shop class, like, you know what I mean? Like learning how to like weld, do woodworking and stuff, learning Spanish, not because I was like in pursuit of like getting a degree. I was just like, for a couple $100, like I could like learn how to do all this cool stuff. And like the idea of college changed. So it's like, I just going for fun.
Right.
And at some point, I'd amass like all these units, right? Because I'd go like at night, in the week. I was like a single guy, right? I could like go to school at night and sort of work during the day. I had a lot of energy. And the counselor was like, he's like, you have like 70, 80 units. Like you could have gotten an associate's degree like 20 units ago. When are you going to transfer to like go to college? I was like, I'm not. He's like, well, what are you doing here? I was like, I'm learning stuff. He's like, well, most people go to college and get a degree. I was like, I don't care about that. And he's like, well, don't you want one? I'm like, not particularly. He's like, why not? I was like, I've already been to school trying to do that. And like, they don't teach you anything actually about like business or making money. So I come here to learn fun stuff. I pay you some money, you teach me how to make websites. I pay you some money, you teach me Spanish, Right. And he's like, he was just like, his mind was kind of blown by this. Like he'd never experienced anything like that. Long story short, the guy's like, why don't you check out going to university? And I was just like, will it make you feel like you did your job if I just go to one of these orientations? And he said, yeah. And I'm like, okay, what's the closest school to me? He said, well, there's a California State University in San Marcos. I said, where's that? He's like, it's off, tells me the exit. And for the longest time, I've always thought that was like the Vista County Jail. Anyway, so I end up there and it looks interesting. And I ultimately decide I'm going to go back to school and pursue a degree in communications, right? Like communications media. And I ended up getting a minor in like women's studies too. And so I'm back going to like actual, university level. I get my associate's degree and then I'm back in college. And then like after my first year being there, which I found to be like really interesting and really great. And I think like having a different perspective on college, going back there to just like learn and become a well-rounded individual and know that like, they're not going to actually teach you like really practical things like how to make money, made it kind of a really enjoyable experience for me and felt like a break from life. But in the middle of that, going like into my senior year there, everything fell apart. Like all that happened, right? I lost everything. Someone really close to me is dying from cancer. My dad's like going to prison. My life is just like mess. And I have this existential crisis. And I went from like, owning a house and making all this money to like where, the two men that I look up to most, one's going to prison, one's going to die. And, I don't really have a job anymore and like no more income. And now I'm like in my senior year of college, right? It's like I did everything so backwards, right? The way that it all sort of like went down. And, I spent the next like year, to answer your question, it was like I'd go up and visit my dad in Lompoc, right? Like in the federal penitentiary. And then I would stop by and go see my, I'd go see Mike Watson, who's dying, right, of cancer, spend like an afternoon with him, and then come home and like study for tests, right? And took out college loans my final senior year and was kind of living off them to like make ends meet while I made a transition. And getting back to your question, like what I did for money at that time was like, I was kind of reeling, figuring out like who I was and learning that all those friends that I thought were friends like went away when the money went away, and was reinventing myself and kind of stuck into college. Didn't really need to figure out. The only reason I really stayed for the senior year was because like I had access to cheap money via college loans. That would allow me to kind of like stay in my, like my one house I was living at, I was like paying the mortgage really with college loans. You know what I mean? Like going into debt at this point. And after I'd lost everything, I ended up like 2010, not only jobless, but like, negative $180,000 like in debt with more school loans like piling on, and it wasn't good. So I started looking at jobs and I took like a bunch of like different jobs that were like bad, working for all kinds of different people in some kind of sales capacity. I was always told when I was young that, if you're a good sales guy, like you always have a job, and that's true. Like everybody always needs a good sales guy, and if you can sell, you can eat, regardless of what it is. But man, I did a lot of really lame jobs that I hated, that were in sales from like 2010 to like 2013 or 14 until I found like a cool company that, was selling a health and wellness product, which is ultimately how we met, and dug into that for a while. And that was cool because you could build a community, and, it was like well within my wheelhouse of marketing and networking, and we built it back up. I finished college. I ultimately like filed a bankruptcy, in the early 2010s that helped me like, at least like just like restart my life at that point. And I was just a lot more humble. I had been to that point where like I had, just like retrospectively looking back at it, I'd been through so much. My sponsor passed away like later in that year. My dad ultimately like got out of prison, was able to like get his life back and his medical license back so he could practice medicine again. And like, I got out of the hole, you know what I mean? I climbed out of the hole and I came out of that whole situation, like just with a whole lot of humility.
And you wrote a second book, right?
Wrote a second book. The second book was called The Young Entrepreneur's Guide to Life.
The Young Entrepreneur's Guide to Life.
The Young Entrepreneur's Guide to Life, and that basically is that is a how-to guide. That's like the book I would have wrote myself if if you were thinking about going to college for to like learn how to start a business or be an entrepreneur. That was the guide. That was the book that I would have wrote to my 24-year-old self. Letting me know that most entrepreneurs are going to end up bankrupt at one point, that you're going to fail at a bunch of businesses before like you get one that's like a winner, that you could fail at like 10 and all you need is like one really good one to go.
That's the truth.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, and I covered a lot of things like how to do college in that book too. Like I realized that after I got my degree and finished, that, college doesn't need to be a full-time, all-encompassing, thing that takes up your entire life. You can easily work full-time and go to college 2-3 days a week and get it done. That's how I did it. I didn't have a choice. Like in the end, I needed to work. I needed to figure it out. So, I wrote that book, and shortly after that was like, I had my first tech startup, which eventually ran out of funding, called Roommate Facts. And then I got into, doing like consulting in marketing and advertising. That was kind of my end. I kind of made that transition into more digital media and marketing, going from more traditional advertising means into more digitally focused like online campaigns back when, if you remember in like the early 2010s, kind of SEO was like the name of the game. And then when paid ads came out, that was like something that they didn't know would work. And I kind of doubled down on being good at like paid ads and figuring out how to really understand that side of the business. That's when I started, WC Ventures, which consulted businesses and helped them, take their businesses online, go from more like traditional type advertising models, mailers to doing more paid advertising, and really hone my skills at doing that. And, ultimately like built it. I was able to like to manage that company while I was bringing on more consulting clients, and got recruited to, run this currency trading school that I had gone to. I went to this currency trading school to learn how to trade Forex because I was looking for ways to make, more streams of income, so I was like sort of investing in different things again in the market. And then I had real estate. I wanted to learn how to actively trade. That was something I fell in love with. Traveling. I went to like Indonesia, to Bali specifically for the first time, like 2011 on a surf trip, and fell in love with that place. And been back every year for about a month, even through marriage and kids until the pandemic. And that was what really made me like the motivation, try to figure out how to make money from a computer anywhere in the world. And that's what got me into currency trading. And, one thing led to another. And then I was like, bringing that entire school online. And then I ended up as the executive director at that institute. And I was like getting lots of opportunities. I spun off, the formal version of like what we do in the marketing and advertising space is Bolt Goodley. And I have some partners in Las Vegas where we've got that firm. And then I was able to scale that and kind of step out of the day-to-day, with that and focus more on the consumer data lead generation side of like that biz, which has been like my bread and butter, and then work on other different projects, that I've been able to over the time. Most recently, I had like one of my best friends come asked me to CEO like his tech startup, which is in the water technology like space, right? So I'm getting all these neat opportunities like a day, and it's really cool because it's like at this point in my life where everything that like I've been through, and here I am now. I'm like 38 years old today, and married, and I've got a 2 and a 5-year-old like kid, and like all of these life lessons that I've had is like a culmination to everything that like I've done up to this point. And it's really interesting looking back, and, more recently, like this last August, I lost my real dad. He died from COVID.
He died from COVID? Yeah.
Well, he had cancer for the second. COVID's ultimately, the final diagnosis of how he passed away. But it was really, he had cancer for the second time in 2018. I had it once in 1984, the year that I was born. beat it, had it again in 2018, beat it again. But, his immune system was kind of flushed from the chemotherapy that he'd been doing. And when he got COVID, and this is kind of late in the game for COVID, this is like after it had sort of like been through, we were all so very careful as like a family. And he got sick and none of us were expecting that. It was very, very all of a sudden, very unexpected, but ultimately, the reason why he couldn't recover from that is because his immune system was shot. And, that was interesting too. Things got very real when it came to COVID and the pandemic. That was like, we lost him, and I think about him all the time, man. I'm still really, really upset about it. And that's all still very fresh for me and in our family. But
if there's one thing you could say to him right now, what would it be?
Well, I mean, I've said everything to him, so it's like I said, like the last 5 years have been like golden, 8 years have been like golden years for like me and my family. My dad got to be there for all of it, coming from where I come from and like, how things were looking at like a very young age for me to where I am now. I knew that my dad was extremely proud of me. He would tell me on a regular basis, and, they ultimately moved into like the first house that I bought down here, so live 5 minutes away. I spent a lot of time with my dad. I really have no regrets on that fact. Some people don't even get to meet their dad. You know what I mean? Let alone get to have a relationship like with their dad, or even have a good dad that's like there and that's showing off. I fucked a lot of that off when like I was younger, and so I made it a point that in my later life that I was going to honor the fact that like I was lucky enough to have a good relationship with them, to spend time and do that with them. So it's like my dad knew everything that was going on. He was up on what was like happening, and we got to spend a lot of time together. And I just tell him I'd love him, like I love him, like I always have. And so that's the only thing that I'd say to him right now. But it's like he already knows, he already knows. Like I said that plenty before. It wasn't like there was any unfinished business or anything like that. It's one thing that I learned about.
That's gotta feel good.
Yeah, and that's one thing. That's one of the positive takeaways. It's like having, I guess, like coming up in a world where there's a lot of chaos. Like looking back on it now, I'm a little bit older. Half the guys that I was like running around with like in high school, like half of them, like let's call them 25, and maybe like 5 of those friends are like really close friends of mine. Half of them are dead. I'm 38 years old and half of them are dead. Most of them died through my 20s, and it was drug, alcohol related, or suicide, which usually had drugs and alcohol involved in it. 2 of them being really close friends, and another 10 of them being like guys that like I ran with that were like in the pack. And none of these guys were doing as bad of the stuff that I was doing at my age, So like moving into it, like moving more forward, it's just like if half my buddies didn't make it through like to 25, so I'm saying if, things like fentanyl or Oxycontin was like around back then in the day, it's just like, I can't tell you how many times back then where we took pills and kind of didn't know what it was. And, most of us would be dead like a lot sooner, but it really kind of, it's crazy to think about it too, because like I said, half the guys that wound up not making it, I thought they were fine. You know what I mean? They weren't nearly as bad off as I was, but like it's a progressive disease. It's one of the things that's like helped me to stay sober, like in the long term, is to know that it's just like you don't magically get better. You know what I mean? It takes work like all the time, and that humility, that striving to do more, the motivations like may change here to there, but like at the end of the day, I as much as I say like I did it for my dad and my parents or my future kids or anything, like I had to do it for me first and foremost. I can't be I can't help anybody if I can't help myself. You
gotta put your mask on first.
Right. Yeah. And I had to like really go deep and like figure that out. And I got better. I did recover. There's no way I would have attracted the wife that I married, not having done the work that I needed to do to like get there. There's no way I would have been able to get to where I've gotten in business, without having to go through the triumphs. If anything, it's just like the circle has gotten like smaller. I'm not really easily shaken these days, the fear of failure isn't really like something that, I don't know, paralyzes me anymore. It's just sort of like a part of the game. And I'm getting to a place like at 38 years old where I don't really regret anything. There isn't a lot of, there isn't like a lot of regrets where I'm just like, man, I wish I could have done that differently. I think, I think there's learning experiences and then there's moving forward,
Yeah. So as we wrap up here, what, if you could say something to somebody who may be in that situation that you were when you were younger, and to help them guide them through into life now to make that transition, what would it be?
Yeah. And I always like when I hear different things like this, you always get like a cliche, just like, keep going and don't give up. And, like you're going to make, which
That doesn't help anybody.
No, it's all bullshit. I think that it's not all bullshit, but it's like, if you're not in a place to hear that, it's bullshit, know? And so what I think I'd have to say is like somebody who's just like, in the shit trying to figure it out. It's just like, either like you got to get to a point where you're going to fail faster, and make a change. Because for me, it's just like pain is an incredible motivator, and if anything over the years, what I've learned is that I attempt to try not be in pain before I make these positive like choices. But if you're a guy like me, I'm thick headed,
Yep.
and I need to get smashed sometimes in order to like break, the mold or like really grow in character. And so if you're like a really wise person, you can learn from that, like you can learn without having to like get the black eyes, and I think that if you've got that skill, that's fantastic.
I don't have that.
Yeah. If you're not, on the other hand, like most of us, then go out and get the black eyes, get them quick, and get back up in the fight, because, you just need to stack experience before you can get to the point. And I think that that's really what it takes, fail fast, get back up and keep getting black eyes. And eventually like you'll start winning.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Steve. Appreciate having you in here.
Thanks for having
me. Really insightful, man.
Thanks, man.
Now, real quick before we run out, where can everybody get in contact with you?
StephenEWolf.com. I still have a website. You can contact me there, find out different publications there. And, I'd say that's probably the best thing. I don't know.
They can find your books on there as well.
You can find books on there. I think it's AEF Wolf 1984 on Instagram, but I don't really check it. And then, I'm actually on LinkedIn and Facebook a lot these days. So, you can always find me, reach out to me there. I believe I've got a profile, but StephenEWolf.com, that's sort of like my site with my basic bio that I've had for years. You can definitely get in touch with me there.
Well, thanks, Steve.
Cool. Appreciate it.